Was that in the 1960s?
No, it was actually in the 40s. Okay, thank you. All right, thank you for coming. Welcome everybody to the interdisciplinary seminar. It's a pleasure to have you here among us today, Professor Dickinson from the CS department at the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor Dickinson got his BS in Systems Engineering from University of Waterloo and MS and PhD in Computer Science from University of Maryland in 88 and 91. He's currently professor at University of Toronto, and he was also associated with the Computer Science Department. He was a faculty at Computer Science Department at Rutgers in the Rutgers Center for Cognitive Science. From 94 to 95, he was a research professor there, and then assistant professor. He's been many places, among them at the MIT Media Lab, and he was a visiting also at Toronto, and then came back as associate professor and then full professor. And he also worked for Real World for Grinnell System in San Jose. And it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, and the field is yours.
Thanks very much, Hamid. It's an honor to be here. It's my first time to Raleigh and first time to NC State, and enjoyed interacting with the group so far very much. So
And you understand why we're so good at
it's
hockey.
that's right. I wish our hockey team was as good as yours, actually. So the topic of my talk today is object categorization and the need for many-to-many matching. And I'd like to begin by showing you a figure. This is a statue that I saw in Prague at the Prague National Gallery. And when I saw this statue, I took a picture of it because it really captures the essence of what I'm trying to do and what I believe is the need for many-to-many matching. So, looking at this statue, can you tell me what you see? What are these figures? Two people. Okay. So the point is, if you were to run today's state-of-the-art local feature detectors, you would find many local features, corners, sift features, patches, whatever your feature du jour is. You would extract these local features, yet somehow the notion of a human arises not out of these small local features, but groupings and abstractions of these things. So in fact, if you're looking for a one-to-one feature correspondence between this object and in fact yet another abstraction of it, you're not going to find it using today's local features. Instead, the mapping, the correspondence, is many-to-many at the level of local features and only one-to-one at higher levels of abstraction. Okay? So in fact, this is not the common trend in computer vision right now in the area of categorization, where there's a strong one-to-one local feature assumption. And in fact, we can go back to David Lowe's work on sift features, which you may be familiar with, which is one of the most popular examples of this. Very powerful feature developed for exemplar recognition. You define local features and you take another image of the same exemplar subject to transformation, occlusion, etc. And you find local correspondences between these very stable local features. That's how we do recognition of exemplars in the presence of occlusion, clutter, noise, etc. Works very well. Another example is work on so-called constellations of features, where for certain kinds of categories where you have very strong geometric regularities, you might be able to even match local features among different exemplars that belong to the category, but albeit a very restricted category. Still, the one-to-one local feature correspondence. So in fact, this one-to-one correspondence is nothing new, but it stems from classical recognition work done in the 60s, and the assumption has been maintained throughout the last 4 decades. So for example, back in the early days when people built object models out of higher order shape primitives like generalized cylinders or superquadrics or geons, for example, they computed one-to-one correspondence among these shapes. And to get it to work, they had to lift the level of abstraction of the image to meet the actual cylinders. They couldn't deal with the one-to-many correspondence between these abstract parts and the local features, so they brought the images up closer to the model so that For example, occluding boundaries or occluding curves in the image matched one-to-one to contours on the model. When we moved into the 80s, we started to build stronger models, stronger geometric models that captured the exact geometry of a 3D object. Still, we had to move the low level, we moved the images closer to the model. They couldn't be textured objects, couldn't be too much clutter. And again, we assumed that contours in the image, corners in the image matched one-to-one to polygonal edges on the model or contours on vertices on a model. And still, even in the 90s, when we brought the models all the way down from very categorical models down to images, templates themselves, again, there's this assumption of one-to-one correspondence of local features, beginning with pixels in the 90s and up to things like SIF features and even back into contours, which we're seeing a resurgence of now. So this one-to-one correspondence has been invariant for the most part through the last 4 decades of work on categorization. The problem is this restriction of one-to-one correspondence between features really makes your recognition more exemplar-based. Your model is really more or less a template of the image structure, albeit a flexible one, but still somewhat of a template nature. However, as I showed you in the first slide with these statues, different exemplars belonging to the same category may not have a single local feature in common, not a single local feature. Only at higher levels of abstraction, once you group and abstract these features for the two types of statues I showed you, only then do you start to see one-to-one correspondence emerge. And you may still not see it there. For example, I can show you 2 chairs, one with 3 legs and one with 6 legs, and ultimately the correspondence among the larger scale abstract parts is 3 to 6 among the legs. And that's why you're starting to see a resurgence in shape grammars, for example, that allow you to parameterize the actual structure of the models. Corresponding abstractions, if you can lift the models higher, they define implicitly many-to-many correspondences of local features. Okay, so let me give you 3 example domains which I'm going to cover in this talk. One is given two images of different exemplars belonging to the same category, we'll run somebody's favorite region segmentation algorithm on it, and we'll build a region adjacency graph. Okay? And what we'll see is, even though these 2 objects belong to the same category, there isn't a whole lot of one-to-one correspondence between the nodes in these graphs. And if I want to somehow identify the correspondence between the body of this cup, the body face of this cup, and the body face of that cup, I'm talking about a 4-node to 4-node correspondence here where there is no sub one-to-one node correspondence, right? So it's almost the collection of these nodes match the collection of these without any individual nodes being in correspondence. So that's one example. Here's another example of the domain of shock graphs. So you can think of a 2D silhouette, you compute a medial axis, like a skeletonization, and then you color the points of the medial axis according to the qualitative shape of the radius function. Is it constant in radius? Is it monotonically increasing or monotonically decreasing, etc.? So you can color these, and you map these branches to labeled nodes in a directed acyclic graph that's ordered from larger chunks of the object down to smaller chunks of the object. So here we go again. Given 2 views of this dog here, we want to ask ourselves, what's the correspondence between the 4-leg structure here and the 4-leg structure there? The correspondence we would have to identify are these 2 rooted directed acyclic graphs here and here. Again, no local node-to-node correspondences, but at a more abstract level, this entire subgraph matches that entire subgraph. Here's one final example. This is a blob and ridge decomposition of an image, a multi-scale blob and ridge decomposition from the group of Tony Lindberg. And what you do is try to extract compact structures or elongated structures at some characteristic scale. And when you have larger structures overlapping smaller structures, then you have a parent-child edge between them from coarse to fine. And you also have sibling relations between the nodes of a given graph. So again, we have a directed acyclic graph, and what we have here is a 2-node to 3-node correspondence as well. So in all of these domains, if you want to pull yourself above template matching, you have to be prepared to match collections of features or many-to-many graph matching. Okay? So in this talk, I'm going to review very briefly 3 ways that we have addressed this problem of many-to-many matching. In the first case, I'm going to show you that back to that first example where, given a set of exemplars belonging to a category, we're going to try to tease out the common structure that's generic to the entire category. Right? In the second case, we're going to take a different approach and try to find abstractions of the structure such that we can match collections one-to-one. That's the second approach. And in the third approach, we're going to visit the many-to-many matching in the explicit graph domain and look for a transformation that takes the nodes in the graph to some other domain for which we can more efficiently compute a many-to-many correspondences with the solution mapping back to the solution in the graph domain. So I'll quickly review these 3 examples. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Here's the first one. As I showed on the previous slide, we have 3 exemplars in similar viewpoints belonging to the same category. And what you really want to do is look at this and say, what's common to all of these exemplars? What's the essence of this object? And you might hope to get something like that, for example. There's a notion of a body face, there's a top, and there's some kind of handle. And of course, the geometry of the handles is all a little different, and the exact geometry of the body faces is slightly different. And in fact, you have this textural difference as well in each case. And I'm not going to make any claims now whether the model that we recover here is 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. What I'm going to talk about is invariant to that right now. Okay? So here's the formulation of the problem, and to explain this, I'm going to introduce a very simple example right now. So let's take these 3 cubes in similar orientation, and let's assume these cubes are textured in such a way that if we run our region segmentation and build a region adjacency graph, we get these 3 graphs. And in fact, with the exception of a single node-to-node correspondence between this top face and that top face, there are no node-to-node correspondences in these graphs. Yet somehow you, the human, look at this and say, I see the same thing at some higher level of abstraction. And we're going to try to find that common abstraction, and we call it a lowest common abstraction, like a lowest common denominator, if you will. So how do we do that? Well, let's consider just one of these exemplars now, and we're going to take this graph, and we're going to look at all the space of all graphs derived from this graph by taking an edge and contracting it and forming a new graph. And we just keep doing that.
So I'm sorry, how did you get the graph?
The graph is just a region adjacency graph. Segment the regions.
Okay.
Each node is a region, and there's an edge between every pair of adjacent regions.
Okay.
Okay? So now we have the graph, and we look at the space of all graphs formed by collapsing an edge. Okay? And you get a massive number of graphs, and if you keep collapsing and collapsing, eventually they'll all collapse down to a single region, which represents the silhouette of the whole object. Okay? We could do that for each of these input graphs, and each gives us this lattice of graphs. And now we can formulate our problem as trying to find, in the intersection of all of these lattices, that graph which is maximally complex or has the most information. Okay? And we call that the lowest common abstraction. So it's the maximal graph that's isomorphic to all of these lattices, which is contained in the intersection of these lattices. Okay? Now the problem is we can't possibly generate these lattices. They're exponential in size, right? So somehow we need some efficient approximation to dealing with this problem. So the first thing we're going to do to restrict the problem is, instead of looking for the lowest common abstraction of all these different n exemplars, let's just worry about 2 for now, right? We're going to do it for pairwise, for every pair of exemplars, right? And then what we'll do is we'll call the collection of all these pairwise common abstractions a weak approximation to the intersection of all the lattices. Weak in the sense that what's common to 2 may not be common to all of them. Okay? And then once we have this weak approximation to this intersection, then we're going to search that intersection for a good solution that gives us a good approximation. So that's the idea. Now the problem is, even going from n to 2, we still can't overcome the intractable complexity of just a single lattice. So we still need to simplify further. So, illustrating, here's one lattice, okay? Here's another lattice. Here's the intersection of the lattice. We can't compute these lattices ahead of time. They're too large. So how on earth do we find, how do we find the intersection of the lattice? Well, it turns out that we know one member of the intersection to begin with. We know that the silhouettes must be common, right? That has to be at the apex of each lattice. So we're going to start with a known member of that lattice, of the intersection, and we're going to bore our way down and try to find some kind of structure that maintains commonality to both lattices. Okay? So how do we do that? Let's look at a simple example. Here are the two blocks, and what I've done is I've overlaid the region adjacency graphs, or the region map, over the two silhouettes. So we're at the top of the lattice now. We have these two silhouettes. What we're going to do is look for a pair of cuts in these graphs along region boundaries. We're going to look for a pair of cuts, one per graph, such that the shape, the corresponding shapes on either side of the cut are similar. So for example, this shape is similar to this shape, and this shape here is similar to this shape. And if that's true, if the shapes are sufficiently similar and the relations between the shapes are similar, then we're going to recursively descend. So for example, let's look at these L-shaped pieces on the left. Here they are here. Now we're going to look for a pair of cuts that divides these two pieces into a pair of shapes that are also similar. So if we find these cuts, for example, then the shape of the entire top here is similar, and the shapes of the entire bottom is also similar.
No.
Okay? And we've recursively tried to descend below the level, we'll find that, well, there's only one cut we can make in each of these, and if we make that cut, the shapes are no longer similar. So we terminate. We can't go below this level. Similarly here, there is no cut to make on this shape. We can make the one cut here. We make the cut. Again, we lose our similarity. And over here, these two were terminal to begin with. Once we made this cut, we had terminal pieces. The union of these pieces represents our lowest common abstraction. Okay? So the problem is, turns out we've taken one very complex problem, finding pairs of cuts, and to enumerate all possible paths through these graphs, the cross product of all possible is yet another complex problem. So we've got to go further still.
How do you do the cuts though? I mean, these are arbitrary cuts that you.
No, these are along region. These are cuts on the adjacency edges between the nodes in the graph that represent the regions.
Oh, so they're okay.
All right.
So you're not searching for.
You got to search for the right path, but you're always along region boundaries. Okay. So how are we going to do this? We need a final step to simplify the problem. The first thing we're going to do is form a dual representation of our region adjacency graph. We're going to call it a boundary segment graph. So now the nodes are the boundaries between regions, and there's an edge between the node if the boundaries are adjacent. Okay, it's just a dual of our original graph. Such that originally, a cut along region boundaries in the original graph now translates to a path along nodes in the boundary segment graph. All right, so that's the transformation we need to start with. And now we're going to combine these graphs together to form what we call a product graph or an association graph. So how do we do that? Well, we have our two graphs, our boundary segment graphs now. And for every possible pair of nodes, drawing one from this graph and one from this graph, we're going to create a node in our product graph. Okay, so for example, for these two nodes, there's a node over here somewhere. And for these two nodes, there's a node over here somewhere. And because both of these nodes are adjacent, there'll be an edge between those corresponding pairs in the product graph. Okay? So this is our association graph derived from the two boundary segment graphs. And now the final step. The final step. If we choose an appropriate set of edge weights in this graph and some appropriate objective function, cost function, then we can compute a shortest path in this product graph. The shortest path corresponds to a pair of paths in the boundary segment graphs, which in turn map to a pair of corresponding cuts in the original region adjacency graphs. right? And once we have these hypothesized cuts, then we have to check the shapes of the two and the relations to verify. Okay? So a shortest path in the product graph with appropriately chosen edge weights will try to point us to a good set of corresponding cuts which ultimately yield shapes that are similar on both sides of the cuts. So let's have a look at some results. Here are 3 exemplars drawn from the cup. Here are the 3 region adjacency graphs. And what you see here in orange is the lowest common abstraction for this pair, and for that pair. It's common to all pairs, right? And so you can see in this simple example that the lowest common abstraction has captured the notion of a body face that at some level of abstraction is common to all of these cups. It's captured the notion of an elliptical top. It has no idea what that means, of course, whether it's a hole or, because I said we're not going to distinguish between 2D and 3D here. It's captured a notion that there is a long region here, despite the variance in the shape of all of these handles, and that there's something inside of that. Of course, again, it doesn't know it's a hole. Okay? So it's been able to tease out some of the common structure that doesn't live at the level of everybody's favorite features, but rather at the level of some hallucination or grouping of these features, abstraction of these features. And it's found the common example. Here's a case that didn't work so well. Again, we have 3 inputs. We have 3 region adjacency graphs. And somehow, as it was boring top down from the silhouette, it couldn't get around this region. It couldn't subdivide this region into 2 pieces. And the reason is the topology of the adjacencies between these various regions is actually quite different. The handle is not adjacent to the top like it was in this case. And it couldn't find a cut. It couldn't find a pair of cuts which found similar shaped regions on both sides. And so it terminates. It goes down as far as it can. Right? So what this suggests is if you have some kind of bad exemplar with some strange topology, you drive the solution. If you insist on a consistent solution for all the examples, you drive it to some kind of overly simplistic solution. And the worst case is if I added a completely undersegmented silhouette here, it would give you the trivial solution of the silhouette because you can't decompose the silhouette at all, right? So you need some way of dealing with outliers, and that's why we go back to this n choose 2 set of solutions, right? So if we now take these 3, we compute the LCA of all possible pairs, and we compute the LCA of those new ones that we add, pairs of those, etc. And we keep doing that, throwing away duplicates. We can build this lattice. And then, as I said, we can formulate the problem as trying to find a member of this lattice that has strong support from the bottom, it has richness from the bottom, but tolerates the existence of an outlier. And we formulate that as finding the median element of this graph. Question?
No.
Sorry. Okay, so in this case, again, we're able to find this, even though there are more abstract solutions in the intersection lattice, right? This weak intersection lattice, we will find the one that is closest to the bottom. Okay. All right. So that was the first case, trying to, and in fact, what you get now, if you map these things back, you get an explicit many-to-many mapping of these regions. If you take the body face and you go back to these things, you're establishing a many-to-many correspondence between the component regions, still assuming a one-to-one correspondence at this more abstract level. Okay, so let's look at the next problem. This is the shock graphs, and I said, you recall, the 4-leg structure is one subgraph. The 4-leg structure is a subgraph over here. There may not be any node-to-node correspondence, and we need to find some kind of similarity between these 2 structures at some higher level without getting too pinned down with the exact structure of the graph. So to do that, to try to search for a lower dimensional characterization of the shape of the graph, we first turn to eigenspaces of graphs, or spectral graph theory, where the eigenvalues of a graph's adjacency matrix, so you have your graph, right? You can map it to an adjacency matrix where there's a 1 in the entry between node I and j if I and j are connected in the graph. It can be an undirected graph if it's It can be a 0, 1, a symmetric matrix. If it's a undirected graph, if it's a directed graph where 1 means forward, -1 means backward, it's an antisymmetric matrix, 0, 1, -1 matrix. Okay, so we can compute the eigenvalues, and they characterize how the degree of the nodes is distributed throughout the graph. So it's a weak characterization of the shape of the graph that talks about how bushy the nodes are, how bushy the branching factor is, and how that's distributed throughout the graph. And if we have coarse-defined feature hierarchies, which are ubiquitous in computer vision, these map to directed acyclic graphs, right? Directed graphs whose matrices are therefore antisymmetric, 0, 1, -1. Are the eigenvalues unique? Of course, we all want unique descriptors. Turns out they're not unique, but they're not that bad. Co-spectral graphs, graphs with different structure that have the same eigenvalues are not that common, right? Are they stable? If you perturb the graph, add an edge, add a node, take away an edge, take away a node, etc., yes, it turns out that they're stable, and we've shown that. So, given the idea now that we can take a whole graph and map it to some set of eigenvalues, right, eigenstructure, how can we use that to characterize the graph so we could match two graphs that don't have the exact same structure? Well, the easiest thing we could try is taking our directed acyclic graph, computing the eigenvalues, sorting them somehow, right? So for the antisymmetric matrix, the eigenvalues are complex, and we can compute their magnitudes, and then we sort them from largest to smallest. We sort them, and we get a vector now. So we've taken the whole graph structure, and we've mapped it now to a vector. And now you just do nearest neighbor search on the database and get similar vectors that represent objects that hopefully have similar branching structure, right? You think that would work. There's two problems, though. One is the dimensionality of this vector grows with the size of the graph. That's a bad thing. The second thing is the eigenvalues are global. So if I occlude this whole portion of the graph, my eigenvalues are going to be perturbed to the extent where I won't be able to match this unperturbed structure to the correct object. Okay, so we got to get around this dimensionality, and we've got to get around the fact that we have a global description. What we need is a local description so we can do matching in the presence of occlusion. So how are we going to do that? Well, we've developed something called a topological signature vector, and here's how we derive it. Okay, so we're going to...
Excuse me, just one second.
Sure.
But don't you have a problem with the ordering, though, in coming up with your agency matrix and computing the spectral?
It's invariant to any orthonormal permutation of the matrix. So,
Uh-huh.
so it's invariant to the ordering of the parts. Right?
Okay.
I'll get to that. That's manifested in a limitation of the matcher at the end.
All right.
In other words, if you took two horses, and then the second horse, you moved its head between its legs, the two would match. The two have the same eigenstructure. Okay, so it's invariant to part ordering, which you could argue is good. Maybe the human that's like this should be able to match the human that's like that. Others would argue that you've thrown away important information about the part ordering. So I won't debate the pros and cons of that, but you're right. It's a good observation. So we're going to compute a signature for this node, for this graph, at the root of this graph for now. It's hopefully going to allow us to search a database and get similar graphs. So what are we going to do? We're going to, first, we're going to look in succession at the children of this node. Let's start with the first child, and let's examine the directed acyclic subgraph rooted at the first child. Okay? If we look at the original adjacency matrix, this subgraph corresponds to a submatrix of the original adjacency matrix. Now what we're going to do is compute the sum of the K1 largest eigenvalues of this submatrix, okay, where K1 is the outdegree of A. Now this all sounds very arbitrary, right? So why do we do this? Well, summing is going to reduce the dimensionality. Okay? Summing is going to reduce the dimensionality of our descriptor. It's going to give us one number. Okay? The largest eigenvalues, in fact, are the most informative about branching structure. And there's bounds, upper bounds on the first and second largest eigenvalue as a function of the nature of the graph and its branching structure. So the useful information is encoded in the largest eigenvalues. And finally, this idea of summing only the largest k1 allows us to normalize this sum or bias it according to the richness of the branching structure that's closest to the root. Because in our assumption of coarse-defined feature hierarchies in computer vision, we assume that things that are higher up in the hierarchy are more salient than things that are lower down in the hierarchy. Okay? So it gives us a way of favoring, in terms of the magnitude of this number, favoring things that have lots of parts high up in the hierarchy. Okay? So what we do is we compute this sum, and then we do it for each of these, right? And then we sort these sums, and the sorted sums become our vector for this node, assigned to this node. Yes?
One technical question about choosing this node, the node in red. You are making sure it's a node at the edge of your graph, right?
No, this is a coarse-defined hierarchy in the graph.
Okay.
It's a directed acyclic graph.
Okay.
So we compute these, we sort them, and it turns out that the dimensionality of this vector is not a function of the size of the graph. It's a function of the maximum degree of any node in the graph, which turns out, for the kinds of graphs we've been working with, is much smaller than the actual sizes of the graphs. And for things like shock graphs, for example, you rarely get, you rarely get you rarely get more than degree 3 or 4 for these nodes. All right? So, turns out we can recursively do the same thing for every non-leaf node. Because remember, summing these eigenvalues over these subgraphs, if any one of these is perturbed by occlusion, any ancestor node will have its signature completely perturbed as well. However, at intermediate levels, those subtrees or subgraphs which survive occlusion will have intermediate topological signature vectors which are intact. So we have a notion of computing the shapes of global parts of the graph, and we have a notion of computing the shapes of local parts of the graph. And if we compute them all possible parts, from global down to small, non-leaf node, we're not going to go all the way to the leaf node, then hopefully occlusion will kill some but still allow others to survive. So, given this now, how do we build a recognition system? Well, we go back to some ideas in the geometric hashing community back in the mid-'80s. We take each of our model graphs, okay, we compute our signatures at all the non-leaf nodes. We go to our database, and at that point, at that low-dimensional point in the database, we store which model lives at that point and a pointer to which node in that model's graph lives at that point. So you can think of this as, here's a pointer to a part that appears as a certain kind of subgraph, and model 1 has that part located at this point in model 1, and maybe other objects will also get added to this list, other objects that share that part or share that subgraph. Okay? And now at runtime, you compute your query graph, you compute your signature vectors for all non-leaf nodes. I shouldn't have done this one. And now you perform a nearest neighbor search, and you get close to a point, and you vote for all the models that share that subgraph. And you accumulate evidence, you sort your accumulators, you grab the top one that has the most evidence to account for the query, and now you got to verify it. Now you got to roll up the sleeves and do the actual work of matching this candidate with the particular query. So how do we do that last step? Well, here's the problem. Let's say that this is our query, and we do this abstraction of the graph, we do a nearest neighbor search, it comes back and says, this object seems to have to reflect your input structure. But because we haven't done the actual matching of the graphs, it's very weak, right? We need to verify it, especially if we want to find some corresponding nodes. So here's the problem. You have these two graphs, and what you want to find is a node-to-node correspondence in these graphs, right? Or more generally, you want to find the largest isomorphic subgraph between these two graphs. But the problem is, in real vision domains, due to noise and occlusion, there may not exist a significantly sized, connected isomorphic subgraph. You put in a bad edge here or there, you take out a node, and you might have common little fragments, but you're not going to have a connected isomorphic subgraph, perhaps of any significant size. So how do we get around that? Well, here's what we're going to do. The first step we're going to take, a seemingly absurd step, is to throw away all the edges of these two graphs. So we'll take this graph, we'll line up the nodes here, we'll take this graph and line up the nodes here. All the edges are gone. Okay? We're going to form a bipartite graph, which is putting an edge between all pairs of nodes, between one graph and the other. We're going to assign some edge weights to these things, and then we're going to compute a maximum cardinality, minimum weight matching for this bipartite graph, which is a standard graph algorithm, right? Choose some subset of edges with minimal weight that maximizes cardinality. Okay? Now, how on earth do we deal? What happens to all the hierarchical structure, which was so important in defining these things, right? Well, here's what we do. The edge weights are going to be computed as follows. The edge weight is a function of the structural similarity of the subgraphs rooted at those nodes. So between 1 and A, for example, you remember we computed this signature vector, which characterizes the shape of the underlying subgraph, right? We're just going to compute the difference between these vectors, right? How similar these vectors are. And what does that say? If the distance is low, it means that your branching structure underneath the two of you is very similar. Okay? Furthermore, we can also add a component that looks at the guts of the nodes and says how similar, for example, is the actual internal shape of the part. This is the only domain-dependent part of the whole thing. If you work with shock graphs, you have a node similarity function that is a certain type. If you're working with 3D data, it might be a completely different type. But the rest of it is invariant, right? Furthermore, we can weight this. If we want to do structural matching that only worries about how parts are connected in the world, we turn down this weight. We don't care about what's inside the nodes. We just want graphs that have the same shape, right? Then you turn this down, you turn this up, and you'll find correspondence, right? And we do this in a coarse-defined manner. We'll find the best matching edge here. We'll take that edge out, and we'll recursively continue with the remaining subgraph, right? So we can tune this thing to give us coarse-defined results. If we want to do exemplar-based matching, we turn down the structural component, and we turn up the geometric component. That will allow us to match within the same category to find which exemplar is closest, right? So it gives us a natural coarse-defined matching mechanism that's based on these same signatures that was computed at indexing time. We don't have to recompute them. Okay? And so we've used this to do indexing and matching of shock graphs. Here are these skeleton graphs, and here are the correspondence. Despite the geometric differences between members of the same category, we're able to find part correspondence for human profiles. Of course, if we terminate the search, if we just were to take the closest, if we just were to take the best edge in this matching and say that 1 is equal to A, we don't need to flesh out the remaining correspondences. We could say and stop and say this whole graph is sufficiently close to this whole graph. If we want to push it down and actually find which nodes are closest, we recursively push it down. Okay?
Excuse me.
Yes?
In the weight function, is there any specific reason for using the exponential function there?
No. You could do a max matching or a min matching and invert it. Same thing. So here, getting back to those blob and ridge graphs I showed, here's a blob and ridge. So we present this face to the image. This is our model. Compute the blob and ridge graph. And then we show a scene, a cluttered scene where there's some other face, and we say, find the best matching between this, find the correspondence between this graph and this graph. And using just these simple topological relations, it's able to find the mouth, one eye, and the face. It's able to find 3 corresponding subparts, which is same with the other example here. It drives home the notion that you can make your representation of the parts extremely weak, impoverished, yet so much information lives in the topological relations among the parts that even with a very simple abstraction, look at all these look at all these noisy blobs and ridges scattered across the image. But just a simple relation between 2 or 3 of them, topologically, inclusion, etc., is enough to prune out everything but your model. Okay? Which really suggests that there's so much potential in the relations of a graph, not just the nodes, that you can make your nodes very simple, but if you have the right relations, you can go a long way. And here's the same framework applied to these medial surface graphs that we talked about. So we compute these things, and we apply the same matcher. The only thing that's different is the node similarity function. So a medial component, how do we compute the geometric distance between the 2 medial components? That's the only domain-dependent part of the whole thing. And now we run it between these 2 things, and sure enough, it is able to find corresponding parts, and it found no correspondences for this, of course, in the Max Cardinelli min-weight matching. It's not going to pull in bad correspondences, okay, depending on how you balance these 2 terms. But it's able to find similar structure across categories, okay? And we've applied it to even other domains as well. And in fact, the entire code for this module, I'm happy to make available to you. The only thing you need to do is plug in your own node similarity function, but if you have these graphs, these are directed graphs, so you need some way of directing your edges, then you can run our indexing and you can run our matching, and you just plug in that one component that says how close are these 2 nodes. Okay? All right, so the last part of the talk is this problem of many-to-many matching. So we've seen trying to compute an abstraction of the graphs and matching the abstractions. We've seen an explicit model supervised grouping using knowledge that 2 members are in the same category to drive the grouping to a common example. But how do we go back and look at the raw problem of many-to-many graph matching, where in fact, in the worst case, any subgraph here can match any subgraph there? Okay? Very difficult problem. So here's how we do it. We're going to take these graphs and we're going to somehow embed the nodes in the graphs into points in some kind of low-dimensional geometric space. Okay? And then we're going to use off-the-shelf algorithms to do many-to-many matching of these weighted point distributions in this space. And the solution to that is a set of flows from the green nodes to the orange nodes. The flows, in turn, can get mapped back directly because these points represent the nodes in the original graphs. The solution to the flows here gets mapped back to a solution in the original graph space that says these 2 nodes, these 2 nodes map these 3 nodes, etc. Okay? So let me say that the embedding, the goal of the embedding, we first compute the shortest path metric over this graph. The shortest path distance between every pair of nodes along edges in the graph. And we use that to embed the nodes into this space with low distortion, throwing away the edges from the graphs as we map the nodes into a set of points, such that the distances between points reflects the original shortest path distance between the nodes. Euclidean distance between the points is an approximation of the shortest path distance between their corresponding nodes with low distortion. Okay? And we looked at a number of methods. Here's one that we started with. Here's one that we explored.
So is this some sort of like same thing as the multi-scale?
Similar, except it has lower distortion, much more accurate. All right? So in this case, which we show for a tree here, we're going to compute an embedding based on what they call a caterpillar decomposition of this graph. So let's start at the root and follow down a path all the way to the bottom. You see that as a dark edge here. Okay? We strip away that path and we follow the next path all the way to the bottom, and then we strip away that one and follow all the way to the bottom here. Those are the level 1 paths in the decomposition. Okay? Now, we strip away the level 1 paths, and now we have 3 level 1 paths, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 level 2 paths. Okay? So the dimensionality of our embedding is going to be 3 plus 7. Okay? Where a given node, let's say this node here, is going to be the second level 2 path. It's based on going down the second level 2 path. Sorry, the second level 1 path. That's why there's a non-zero weight there. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the fifth level 2 path. And Matoucek prescribes a set of weights, right, which minimize the distortion of the mapping. Okay? So every node in here gets mapped to a vector, right, that spreads out these nodes as a function of these path lengths in the graph. Okay? So now what we have is one graph and another graph, and we're going to take these graphs and we embed them into this space. So this graph gets mapped into the blue nodes, and this graph gets mapped to the brown nodes, right? And what we're going to do now, node attributes also get mapped to some mass of the node in the space. I said it's a weighted distribution of nodes. And now we use a standard algorithm for many-to-many point matching, or earth mover's distance. And the analogy for this algorithm is if you have a bunch of piles of dirt and you have a bunch of holes in the ground, what's the least amount of work required to push the dirt into the holes? So if there's a hole nearby me, I'm not going to push my dirt way over to that other hole. Right? And a pile of dirt can be distributed among many holes, and a given hole can receive dirt from many piles. That's why it's many to many. Okay? It's called a transportation problem. So we compute the minimal work required to push the piles of dirt into the holes. Okay? So it says this dirt will flow into those two holes, this dirt will flow into that hole, this dirt is nearby those two holes. So that's the best assignment in the earth movers formulation. And now these flows, these brown flows you see here, blue and green, those flows get mapped back to the many-to-many correspondence between the nodes in the original graph. So this maps 1 to 2 to that, this maps 1 to 1 to that, this maps 1 to 2 to that. Okay? So what's the magic here? There is no magic. It all depends on one important thing. And that is, if you don't assign the right edge weights in your original graph, then if you have the wrong edge weight between these two things, and this one ends up way over here somewhere, this dirt is not going to flow to both of those. It's going to flow here and greedily go over there somewhere. Okay? So in other words, if, for example, if you were matching a human and you had 2 parts here and the other human you had just 1 part, better be the case that the 2 parts have a very small edge weight between them so that they get embedded close together so they flow together to the one big part over here. So if you don't get that edge weight right, it doesn't work. What does it mean to get that edge weight right? That edge weight is the problem of perceptual grouping, to determine how likely these 2 pieces should be grouped together, how causally related they are. And we know that's an open problem. You're going to use some heuristics to try to estimate a good set of edge weights, but if you can't, then this thing does not work very well. All right, so here's a demonstration going back to the blob graphs. We can see that we map these 2 blobs to these 3 blobs. We can see that this big yellow blob gets mapped to these 2 yellow blobs, the blue to the blue, etc. So in the blob graphs, we can go to our skeletal graphs as well, and we find that we can compute many-to-many node correspondences where the skeleton point cardinality in the corresponding nodes is not the same. The number of branches in the graphs is not the same, and yet we can still find this collection of branches, including the nodes and small perturbations, matches this collection of branches as well. So we don't get hung up in trying to match the exact details of the fragments. We can treat these things collectively, provided that the edge weights are well formulated at the beginning. In the last example, using this method goes back to a classic figure in Marr's old work, where he suggested, Binford and Marr both, suggested that you could represent an object at different scales, different levels of abstraction. And he said at some level of abstraction, the human is just a single cylinder. At the next level, you break it out into these very coarse parts. And then any one of these parts you can break out finer. And then you could break the forearm into forearm plus wrist, and the wrist into wrist plus smaller wrist plus fingers, etc. Right? This kind of structure, this abstraction hierarchy, if you will, is a very powerful structure that you don't find in categorization work these days. And how can we learn this kind of abstraction structure from examples? So, can you tell me what these things are? Forget this one here.
Is that like balloon nodding?
Balloon?
Planet.
Planets?
Clock.
Sorry?
Clock.
Clock? That's a good guess. Yeah, I can see that. These are images of human torsos from our blob and ridge decomposition. Sometimes their arms are straight, sometimes they're bent, sometimes their head doesn't get detected, sometimes you get extraneous. But you can see the arms, the head, the body, the arms, bent arm, two bent arms like this, one arm, the other one was lost. This is something hanging on the wall behind the human. Here's another human, etc. You can see the noise. You can see the noise. The question is, if we feed this set of training examples and more of the same into the system, can we learn something that looks like this, like Mar's abstraction hierarchy, his decompositional hierarchy, where it finds that there is a notion of a torso, there is a notion of a left and right arm, and we have learned the fact that these arms can be decomposed, can appear alternatively as these things. Not at the same time. It's an and/or graph. It's not the same kind of graphs that I've showed you before. How can we learn this structure? And maybe you assign some probabilities on these edges that say how likely are you to decompose this into that. And we do that based on this many-to-many matching. Because if you think about it, this, you can only hope to extract something like this if you can solve the many-to-many matching problem, or the restricted version, in this case, the one-to-many matching problem. So what do? We extract the blob graphs. You saw those. We match them many-to-many using the algorithm I showed you. You saw that. Among all of the correspondences, the many-to-many correspondences, you look for the subset that are one-to-one. What does that mean? In all these noisy examples, there was a lot of evidence that some particular part kept showing up. Not all the time, not consistently, but this particular part showed up enough of the times when I matched all of these things pairwise that I think it's significant. When I see those parts, I'm going to populate them in my space. And I don't know how they connect up yet. I don't know what the decompositional relations are, or even the attachment relations, but I'm going to throw them out there for now because there was lots of evidence for them. And now I need to link these parts together. And what I'm going to do is extract the decompositional relations for these particular parts. I'm going to look at the many-to-many flows that involve these parts throughout all my matching data. And when I find good statistical evidence for recurring one-to-many relationships, I'm going to add those edges. And when I look at these parts and I go back to the original graphs and I find recurring attachment relations between those parts, I'm going to add my model attachment relations. And in the end, this is what we learn. This is the structure we learn. And these are the nodes, the final parts in your decomposition hierarchy. What I've shown is an example from the identified clusters of each part. One example part from each cluster. So let's look through this very quickly before I wrap up. So node 3 is the torso node. You see one example of the torso. Node 3 is attached with a red link, right, to number 2. Number 2 is a head node. Here's one example of a head node from that cluster. It's also attached to node 4. Node 4 is the left full arm node. Node 4 is the left full arm node. And now node 4 in turn, through blue decompositional relations, is attached to node 7, which is the upper left arm, and node 6, which is the lower left arm. And we can extract the probabilities of these decompositions as well by just looking at the frequency of these mappings. So 4 gets mapped into 6 and 7. Similarly, 3 is attached to 5, which is the straight right arm, in turn decomposed into 1, the upper right arm, and 8, the lower right arm. Okay? So we have learned exactly this structure from a set of training data, and that allows us to begin to look at the problem. Because we have this many-to-many matching machinery, it allows us to look at the problem of how to build models that capture an object at different levels of abstraction. Okay, so summing up, a few final points. This assumption of one-to-one feature correspondence really supports the recognition of exemplars and highly restricted categories where you can make the assumption that there are corresponding parts one-to-one. Okay? Doesn't work for all objects. Within class variation, chair with many legs, chair with fewer legs, etc., different numbers of parts in each object. Within class variation, scale, articulation, and segmentation errors require a more general framework that allows you to match things many to many, allows you to lift above that fairly restrictive assumption. And finally, the main challenge facing the categorization community in general, which I think is the most critical problem that we need to address, is the problem of developing effective abstraction mechanisms that'll take real images of real objects and somehow lift them up to these qualitative descriptions that we can then match. We can't get mired down in the low-level details of the appearance. We have to lift them up to higher levels of abstraction, and that's been a traditionally very challenging problem that has forced us to move more towards exemplar recognition than categorical recognition. But I think before we can get real traction on categorical perception, we need more effort at this level, which in turn requires effort at two fundamental components that support this, namely segmentation and perceptual grouping, two very difficult and open problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for some questions.
Yes. I guess one of the important things in your method would be extract the parts, right?
Yes.
And I don't know what kind of segmentation you're using, but but if say,
like I said, it's an open problem.
they're painted in a purely black or any pure colors, then you have no idea to segment them by their colors or textures. So what you got was a silhouette for a human, or the whole area for that. So you don't get parts. So how are you going to deal with that?
So let me say that working with a silhouette assumes segmentation. Now you can simulate bad segmentation by throwing in occluders, perturbing the boundaries, etc. Right? But it still seems a long way from taking a real image of a real object against real clutter and segmenting it. This is starting to look at that a little bit, and let me tell you why I think this is on the right track. Here you have a more complex scene, right? You're not doing pure bottom-up segmentation. I agree with you. You take the state-of-the-art region segmenters, edge detectors, etc. How to do figure ground separation in these domains is extremely challenging, right? And frankly, I don't think you can do it. I think that pure bottom-up segmentation without some kind of prior, shape prior, is impossible. But here's where I think the community has misstepped. Acknowledging the need for a shape prior has led the community to bypass intermediate level vision and go and assume a scene level prior. For example, we know we're looking at horses or motorcycles or cows. We're going to assume a very strong prior knowledge of scene content, which really is classical target recognition when you think about it. Okay? But really that shape prior that helps you segment things properly needs to be at the level of an intermediate Gestalt-like shape prior. Symmetry, compactness, homogeneity, continuity, smoothness. That's what Tony Lindenberg did in his work. In other words, he is assuming perhaps an impoverished shape prior of an ellipse. It's either a circle or an ellipse. He won't let them bend or taper or anything like that. But he's saying, I'm coming in here, I don't know what I'm looking at, but I do know that whatever I'm looking at is made up of elongated, highly symmetric parts that could exist at any number of scales. And he, through a technique of automatic scale selection and looking at responses at different scales, He takes a stab at it. It's not very good. Look at all the false positives and false negatives. But at least he used some kind of intermediate shape prior to try to ease the segmentation burden. And I have a couple of students working on ideas along this path. I think that's how you deal with this segmentation problem. But you're absolutely right. These silhouette matchers and shock graph things, you try to run them on real scenes. What do? You run a texture region segmenter that looks for homogeneity of appearance somehow. You hope that some of the regions have enough of the boundary correctly segmented. Fortunately, the shock graph is sufficiently local such that if you perturb this part, it's not going to affect the part at the other end of the object. You're hoping that parts of the region are segmented correctly enough such that the shock subgraph will allow you to index. I had one student that looked at the problem of using partial indexing results, hypotheses, to guide a model-based region splitting and merging process through scales. So if there's part of a region that you think matches this object over here, and you have a region scale space, a region segmentation tree, how can you line up that model with this one to guide some kind of directed splitting and merging of regions to bring your region closer to the model? But it only works if you can index correctly into the model, which means you have enough of the region correctly segmented if you want to deal with a large model base. If you want to assume you only have one model, like a horse or a cow, take the model and go right to the image like the community is doing now with the so-called top-down segmentation methods, right, which are highly effective for the highly useful task of target recognition. But that doesn't scale up, right? Assuming what you're looking at really allows you to avoid the problem of segmentation and grouping, because you put the detector down at all possible positions and you ask yourself, does it group well within the guidance of the detector? You don't have to do anything bottom up in those cases. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Eddie? So you're saying about the target recognition aspect of it, right? So you would give that, you could pass that to say, a rule induction tree, and it could go on and noise. But what you could do is you can prune the tree,
Yes.
the tree,
Yes.
and then you can take the intermediate or the strong parts of the tree.
Yes.
Have you thought about matching that to what you're doing? Because you're starting up here at the root, and you're going down and down. And what I'm seeing from what you've got is anywhere it goes to a leaf, you won't forget that.
Yeah.
But you've got real strong data or information contained at the where the nodes are,
Yes.
right? Where the branches are.
So there's in these directed acyclic graphs, there's information in all the nodes.
All the nodes.
The coarse ones and the fine ones,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And clearly, if the graphs are not occluded, the signatures that we compute are very strong. And if there is similarity between the top of this and the top, this is a forest of graphs. Actually, these are not all connected, right? This is a forest of these DAGs. If there's high similarity between this and this, which there would be only when you have no occlusion or massive perturbation of the underlying graphs, you can stop.
Right.
You don't even need to go down, right? But if these things aren't similar, you have to descend to lower levels which survive the occlusion and perturbation and find these local sub-similarities of these pieces. So the algorithm can do that, can support that.
Right,
It's
so ID3 or that could probably, because it's statistically based, could maybe give you some help.
yes,
Right?
yes, yeah, good.
See, he's surprised, because he was surprised I know about this stuff.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we haven't looked at decision trees to organize databases, for example.
We used them at the Turing Institute for target recognition and stuff
Yes,
like that.
yes.
Right? And although there are problems associated with all stuff, right?
Yes.
But it allows you to. I am a great believer in finding correlations between what I'm doing and is there another technique, and can I,
Right.
can I strengthen what I'm doing by
Right.
understanding what's going on?
Right, right.
It's just another technique to help you.
Right. Well, in fact, if you're interested in this idea of decision trees for model database partitioning and organization, the definitive work would be Kim Boyer and his student Kuntal Sengupta. And they had 2 or 3 PAMI papers back, 8 or 10 years ago on on using spectral properties of these relations among the parts to build a decision tree, to partition a model database to allow you to do sort of a logarithmic search of a database.
Because, I mean, whatever you say, I mean, we're very good at, we're not very good at saying that's an edge.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
As a human, we're not good at that, right? But you're trying to find ways of maybe automating that. So
Yeah.
like it.
But I think my belief is what we're missing in the community is more effort at this intermediate level for segmentation. To try to, we tend to compute these bottom-up segmentations, and then we deal with the data as best we can. You know, you run normalized cuts or some great region segmenter, and then you make do with what you've got. But to me, what you have to do is revisit the notion of segmentation with the aid of an intermediate shape prior. So how do you take something like symmetry or compactness and build it into the objective function for normalized cuts? How do you tie together segmentation and prior shape instead of doing a blind bottom-up segmentation and then doing your best to make sense out of the data? I just don't think that's going to work in the
I think
end.
it ties in with actually a question I had, which is, it's a very basic and fundamental. What is scale? I mean, how do you define scale when you're looking at these things?
Yeah,
I think it sort of ties in with that. Because it's not obvious. Yeah, I mean, just looking at your robot there,
Yeah.
right? How do you start? I mean, what is scale? How do you,
Well, I think I mean, in the practical sense, if you take this thing and you zoom out,
yeah,
it looks like this in the
yeah,
image, right? It looks like that.
You go down and then you.
That's
stop
right. And if
where-
you zoom in, you start getting this detail. So we have to begin by acknowledging that if we want to make our recognition system scale invariant,
Right.
we have to acknowledge that the entire structure of this object changes as a function of scale. So we need.
This is why you had Crowley. You had Crowley as one of your references.
That's right.
Jim Crowley did that. That's what he did.
That's
for
right.
his PhD.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yes, that peak path work he did was.
It's a great piece of work. That
Exactly.
still today does.
And that's a forerunner of this multi-scale blob and ridge work, in fact. It's a forerunner of that. It was the first such effort to use these peak paths to actually do recognition. So,
Familiar, actually.
yeah, it's nice with art, because that was his thesis work.
I'm not familiar with that.
So scale is important to make your system scale invariant. Scale is important because you don't know the prior scale of the object when you segment, so you have to segment at all possible scales, right?
I wondered if you could actually, when I'm saying like it's a photogrammetry, if you could, as people do to rebuild facial structures, is to put patterns on and then segment it and see what you get out of it. See what shapes you get out of it. Put different patterns on the face, project the pattern onto the face, and see what shapes you get out. Can you reinforce it by doing that?
I hadn't thought of that.
That's crazy. See, that's crazy stuff. Yeah, it's cool. It's interesting. Very interesting.
But I think the kinds of features that we're looking at today, quite commonly, things like SIFT, affine invariant patches, etc. I tend to feel, my gut feeling is, for more general categorization, the scale is too small for these features. And certainly the description of these features tends to be overly specific in that it encodes appearance. And these features, just like Lindbergh's stuff, really make a very weak attempt at segmentation. The scale and the maximal response and the anisotropy allow you to kind of predict where that ellipse is, but you're not going into the data and saying, okay, where are the boundaries? Where's the real boundary of this? Where's the figure ground? That's a hard problem. So I think you need to capture the shape of these things. You have to look at all possible scales. For the most part, I don't think that things like texture and color are generic to most categories. Somehow you got to get at that shape. Is there a single shape model for all categories? Obviously not. Some aren't even parts-based, you can argue, right?
Have you looked at the work of Tom Henderson at Utah? Tom,
Oh, from way back.
no, he does some more up-to-date stuff on grammars related to shapes. And
Ah, yes. So that's something that was the shape grammars, the web grammars, the graph grammars were introduced in the late 60s by Rosenfeld, picked up by Fu in the 70s. Lots of work done on these grammars, syntactic pattern recognition. That's right. That's right. It lay dormant for a long time, and then the CL community started working on learning probabilistic grammars from examples for probabilistic parsing.
Giemann.
That's right. And then Zhu and Giemann and people started picking up on that. And now, if you're interested in grammars, there's a paper in a journal called Foundations and Trends in Computer Vision. It's a 105-page manifesto by Mumford and Zhu on grammars, using grammars to recognize objects. And I find this work very exciting because it acknowledges that there is not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence between the members of a class. Now, this is nothing new. As I said, it goes back to Rosenfeld, but in fact, it goes back to one of the classic recognition systems, and that's Brooks' acronym system, where he actually parameterized attachments in his graph using a set of inequalities, right? He said that the plane can have between 1 and 2 jets underlying it. A certain engine can have between 5 and 8 parts attached to it in certain ways. So he actually parameterized attachment. And very important concept, very complex in terms of how he reasoned about these attachments and these parameterized structures. But it was yet another acknowledgement, like the original grammar community, that the world isn't in one-to-one correspondence, that real categories allow not only shape deformation, but structural deformation. And only now are these things beginning to come back with these new probabilistic grammar induction methods and machine learning tools. We can learn these things. Can't learn the structure of the grammar yet. That's what we're actually doing here. We're trying to learn the rules, whereas most of the grammar work today is trying to learn the probabilities on the rules, and you have to specify the rules by hand. But that's going to fall as well. And that's yet another way that the community is moving away from the brittle one-to-one correspondence and allowing many-to-many correspondence. The thing about the grammar is, if you have tremendous variation in the structure, you need a rule for every possible variant, right? It can get very complex.
I think that's where...
And that's where functional recognition sits above even grammars.
Right. That's what I was going to say. I think it's very important to start looking at biology and psychophysics, psychology, and things like that, because we have much to learn and perhaps discover from there. Yeah, I think this is my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.
By the way, this is Eddie Grant. He's in robotics and forgive.